Hey folks, Matthew Weiss here, WeissAdvice.com and WeissAdvice here on YouTube. In this video, I want to show you some techniques for getting sub-basses, deep bass elements to really stand out. Deep bass is a little bit tricky because it's very hard to hear. One of the reasons why I think people struggle with getting their final prints to be as loud as they want them to be is because they'll use these very deep basses, and in order to hear them, they turn them up really loud, but that eats up the overall, I guess headroom would be the way of saying it, the overall headroom in the record, and the overall record just can't get all that loud. So how do we get the presence of the bass to stand up in a way where we don't need as much actual amplitude if our bass is really low? So I'm going to play a little bit of this record here. I'm going to show you two techniques to do it. One is going to be a little bit on the advanced side. One's going to be a little bit more straightforward and easier to do. All right. Let's play this down first. Now we have this very deep sub bass. It's not completely invisible because we do have some overtones, and that's what this is really going to be all about. It's about getting higher frequencies within the bass to kind of stand out so that our ear can identify where the bass is. Now this is not bad by any stretch, but I think that it's a little bit too reduced. So, I mean, one of the ways that we could simply do it is just by grabbing, whatever EQ and then just cranking the ever-living crud out of the upper mids and the mids just to give it more of that energy. But what if we don't have any of that there, right? Like, what if we don't like what's there? I didn't think that sounded particularly good, to be honest. I'm not even sure that I really like the overtones that are present in there. So we might want to even have those removed. In which case, we're not going to hear anything. But what if it's just like a sine bass? We're going to need some kind of a distortion, and that's going to be our first technique. So the first technique is we're going to want to go for second and third harmonic distortion in some degree of relativity. So basically, the second harmonic distortion is going to be our first overtone and our even overtones, which are going to be very closely harmonically related for most of the scale. It's going to sound smoother and more transparent. It's just going to allow the ear to hear the signal better without necessarily saying, hey, I'm a distortion. Third harmonic distortion is going to start getting non-harmonic pretty quick, actually. It's going to start creating overtones that are metallic or weirdly buzzy. And that can be useful as well because it creates a texture, and sometimes when we have very round basses, what we want is a texture. So I'm going to use the black box, the original black box actually here, because that's what I did on the very original record years ago. But Black Box HG2 is more than capable. It's got more settings here. But basically, I'm going to generate some degree of second and third harmonic distortion that I like using a combination of saturation, saturation, and saturation all layered together. Basically, I found a distortion box that I like, and we're going to go for it. So here's our before. After. There we go. Let's try that. Yeah. So now it's starting to stand up in the mix, and to me that's a slightly smoother distortion than just like pushing what was already there. I'm going to do one more time before and after. And it's subtle. It doesn't have to be super pronounced. The idea isn't to make it sound like we've distorted the bass. This could even be backed off a little bit, to be honest. But the difference is that all those overtones are going to show up on small speakers. They're going to show up on laptops. They're going to show up on cars that don't have subs. All of those kinds of places where we typically lose the sub bass, some of that stuff is going to get retained, and it's going to help us find the bass easier with our ear. We're not going to need as much level in order to identify it. Now, what I want to do next is go into a more advanced version of this, something that's a little bit crazier. Let's back this off a touch, push this back up a touch, get something that's a little smoother sounding. There we go. Now we're about level matched. Okay, so what I like to do when I have really deep basses, and I don't always even necessarily use it, sometimes I'll do it just to have it and then end up not using it, but I'll create a distortion layer that I can then use as a parallel track. The way that I do that is I'll duplicate the bass that I have originally, and then I'll filter out any kind of overtones that are already there that I don't like. Now, in this particular case, I actually liked a combination of coupling the overtones with the distortion. It was only the very highest overtones that I didn't like, so I low-passed those out, and we end up with a layer that sounds like this. So pretty darn similar to the layer that started. Now the next step is to distort it with your choice of distortion. I like Decapitator, I like Isotope Trash 2. There's a lot of distortions I like. It would be a long list, so I'm not going to go listing them all, but those are ones that I use pretty commonly. So here I'm using Decapitator, and I've got it on punish mode, so this is not supposed to be subtle at all. So now we have this very distorted bass sound. Different distortions will give you different tones. This is giving me something that's kind of a little bit brassy. And at first it sort of rubbed me the wrong way, but as I started working with it in the mix, I actually kind of liked it that way. But you can always, fix some of that stuff up. Now, the next step is a little challenging, and there's a really advanced way of doing this, and then there's a more straightforward way of doing this. Basically, we're creating a distortion layer, an overtone layer that's going to go on top of the original bass. So what we want to do is remove the bass in the layer. I know it's a little weird to be boosting bass without bass, but that's the idea. So we're going to high pass the result, and maybe EQ it and contour it to be a tone that we like as well. So that's kind of what's going on here. But the main thing is this high pass. It's a pretty steep high pass at like 300 hertz. So I mean, it's definitely not subtle. I mean, you can even see on the analyzer how much bass I'm taking out. Like, it's a ton. Okay, here's where things get a little tricky. As a default, you want to try and do this, if possible, with a linear phase EQ. Why? Because when we have material that is phase coherent and we start changing things with EQ, we're going to get a phase interaction between the original and the duplicate. So if we keep it in linear phase mode, we will not have any kind of phase cancellation happening anywhere in the bass layers put together. So here's our bass. Here's with our layer. So we don't lose any bass anywhere. However, if we do a minimal phase EQ, we are going to get some phase cancellation in the stop band when they're summed together. So this is subtle, but try to focus on the 150 hertz range if you can. Here's with linear phase. Here's minimal phase. I'm going to do it one more time because this is tough, and if you do it on your own, I think you'll have an easier time hearing it. But basically, listen to the body of it, like that 100 hertz to 200 hertz body. With linear phase mode, we keep all of it. Minimal phase, we lose some of it. Now, that's not necessarily a bad thing. So the reason why this can be a little advanced is what's living in our 100 to 150 hertz range. Well, that's usually the presence of our kick. So we can use this technique to also kind of sculpt around the kick. It also has a certain smoothness to the sound, like a dimensional sound, that I don't mind in this exact instance. So I can go either way with this. Minimal phase is giving me something I like. Linear phase is giving me something I like. But I'm gonna keep it in linear phase for now because that's a good default. You're never losing anything when you do that using this kind of a technique. Now the last one is also a little advanced and it's an optional thing, but basically I like wide basses. Sometimes things get a little goofy when really deep tones start getting really wide, but these are not really deep tones. So one way I can kind of have my cake and eat it too is by taking this layer and actually putting a stereo spread on it. And there's a number of ways to do this. iZotope, I think, has the best way of doing it with the imager, but you can do just a simple, straightforward kind of Haas split where you don't delay one side and you delay the other side by like 10, 15 milliseconds, something like that. The reason I like the iZotope one is because it feels a little bit less like a Haas kind of thing where you kind of get a precedence panning effect and you end up leaning to one side. This to me smears it across the entire stereo field, which for like a padding sort of layer I think is really useful. So now when we have that in the mix, it's actually really easy to hear the bass. It just sounds a little bit brassy at the moment. So then I commit this. I print this as a track, as if it was something that was incorporated in the original production, and then I start to work with it in the mix as if it came in that way. And sometimes I'll discard it, sometimes I'll use it, sometimes I'll EQ the crud out of it. In this particular case, I did EQ the crud out of it. My end result sounded like this. And my bass layer sounded like this. And together in the mix, they sound like this. Now, they're also about 2 dB hotter than how I actually did it because I wanted you guys to be able to hear it. But yeah, that basically sums it up. So this is something where not only is it a very useful effect in terms of the technical ability to be able to hear bass on smaller speakers and just hear the bass in general a little bit better, but it's also a really good effect where like you can choose your own way of doing it and kind of stylize it and make it part of your own sound, which I really, really encourage. So, all right, if you dig this video, hit that like button. If you want to catch more videos like this, hit subscribe with the bell notification so you get notified. And lastly, you know what we say here at WeissAdvice. We are musicians, sound is our instrument, and I will catch you next time.